obviously, I've just come from Seoul, from Incheon, earlier this week. I was at the other World Knowledge Forum, the smaller one. But I'm really delighted and excited to be here in Pohang because, I mean, in a sense, obviously, as far as I can understand, this is part of the modern story, the modern industrial story of Korea. Decades ago, officials, business people from Japan and then Korea looked around the world in search of answers about how to build industries of the 20th century, so the steel, the shipbuilding, car making, other industries. And to some extent, they looked towards historical examples from the US, like Alexander Hamilton. They looked towards what the Germans had done in the Prussian era. Today, here's the interesting thing. As we're all confronting the next industrial revolution, the energy transition, people from elsewhere around the world, including the US, including Europe, are now looking here. They are looking towards Korea because they want to understand how to build the industries of the future. And you have extraordinary expertise at the moment in building some of these industries, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's batteries. And so a lot of focus. It was interesting to hear about the story of the World Knowledge Forum and how it came about with Korea thinking after the Asian financial crisis about how to try and learn from overseas. Well, a lot of people really do want to learn lessons from Korea as well. And that's going to be an interesting period that we're going to go through in the future. But anyway, as kind of thinking about those issues, I've started to think about them an awful lot recently, and I've written a book about what I call the material world, which is the underbelly, I guess, of the economy upon which everything else depends. And in the book, I kind of framed this world by talking about 6 key substances, so sand, salt, iron, copper, oil, and lithium. So that's the book. But today I wanted to tell the story a little bit differently. And I wanted to start actually by talking about, I think I've got my slides, by talking about this man. Quick, can you guess who that is? You have to be very quick because the name's about to come up. It's Henry Ford. Henry Ford. Now, I suppose for a lot of people today, when you think about Henry Ford, a lot of people think about him and they remember him within the world of business for a few things. They think about the cars, obviously, the car company. They think about, maybe some people think about his politics, which was to some extent questionable, but other people think about Fordism, so mass production, that kind of process whereby other people learnt to emulate that, the way that we produce so many manufactured goods these days through division of labor, essentially. But there was also something else, and this is the kind of side of Henry Ford that I wanted to talk about. And you get a sense of it by looking at one of the first advertisements for the Model T. So I'm going to bring up that ad. This is one of the first ads, the early ads for the Model T. And aside from the fact that obviously this looks quite different from modern car advertising, is there anything that kind of leaps out to you? Because there's something that leapt out to me when I started reading this, apart from all the text. Probably wouldn't have quite so much text these days. I'm going to zoom in. Have a look at this. Heat-treated vanadium steel. Vanadium steel. This was the alloy that Henry Ford chose to go into the Model T. Without that vanadium steel, the Model T might never have happened. It was stronger, it was lighter, it was better than basically every other steel alloy available at the time. So when Ford was designing the car, he realized that that was going to help. The vanadium steel was going to help to leapfrog the competitors. That was going to allow the car to be lighter, more maneuverable, with a greater power-to-weight ratio, which is kind of what mattered, than other cars of the age, most of which had those conventional alloys. They didn't have vanadium steel. I found that ad really interesting when I was researching my book, Material World. And by the way, this is only one of many. There were plenty of ads where he went on about vanadium steel. It was really part of the marketing process of how he was persuading people to get these cars. But it was interesting from another perspective as well, which is that Henry Ford wasn't just about management. It wasn't just about Fordism. It wasn't just about mass production. He was also obsessed with what we would today call supply chains. So his obsession with vanadium steel is because he was obsessed with every part that was going to go into his car. And when you think about a motor car, what is it? It's kind of an assemblage of thousands of separate products. So you've got the cogs and the belts in the engine, the transmission, the tires, the seats, even the paint, the exterior. Economists call this stuff intermediate inputs. And even back in Ford's day, most car companies bought much of it in from elsewhere. So you would buy it from somewhere else and assemble it in your plant. General Motors, for instance, who obviously at the time were the big competitor with Ford, we're talking back in the 1910s, the 1920s, they saw selling cars more as primarily as a kind of challenge of marketing rather than engineering. So marketing first, engineering second. It was about selling the cars. It was about persuading people that the cars were great. What went into them, that was almost kind of secondary. But Henry Ford was very different. He wasn't just obsessed with understanding the supply chain. He was also obsessed with producing as many of the components that went into the car himself, or rather by Ford. So he didn't just want vanadium steel in the car. He wanted to make the steel himself. He wanted to control the supply chain, not just down to each component, but all the way down to the bottom, okay? So this is the River Rouge plant. This was the big plant for Henry Ford. And what you can probably make out there is you've got steel making happening. You've got steel making happening at the car plant. So this was an enormous car plant. And unlike today's car plants, it wasn't just putting cars together. You also had foundries. You had glass manufacturing, so they were making the glass on site. You had tire works as well, blast furnaces, mills turning out steel. He even owned the iron mines. He was that obsessed with understanding and owning every part of the production process. He owned the limestone quarries, where the flux would come from when he was making that iron. The coal mines, where the coking coal would come from that goes into the blast furnaces as well. He even owned the trains on which that coal and the limestone were being carried to his factories. So he was obsessed with owning basically everything. It was vertical management. And perhaps the most extreme example of this obsessiveness came when he attempted to create an entire colony in the Amazon rainforest to provide the rubber that was needed for his tires and engine belts. I'm not even joking. He made his own town in the Amazon called Fordlandia, which was designed to try and provide the rubber that was going into his cars. He was so obsessed with every part of that manufacturing process. Now, Fordlandia was not a success. Today, it's totally abandoned. It's slowly consumed by the trees and the vegetation. And it's not hard to find business gurus who talk in adoring terms, obviously, about mass production. It's very hard to find business gurus who talk in adoring terms about Henry Ford's obsession with making every single part of the car. It's very much out of fashion, and a lot of people think that these days is basically a bit weird. And today, there are very few car makers who make their own steel. As far as actually I can work out, the only one that comes close is Hyundai, who have their own steel company, but it's not quite the same. It's not on-site blast furnaces right next to the car plants. So it's not quite the same as Henry Ford. And the vast majority of car makers do it totally differently. I mean, in a sense, maybe the closest thing that we have today, at least in terms of the rhetoric, is Tesla. Because Elon Musk likes to talk about how he doesn't just want to make the cars and the drivetrains and the control panels. He also wants to make the batteries, and he wants to make the cathode active materials that go in the batteries, and he wants to get hold of the lithium as well. But as with a lot of things that Elon Musk says, a lot of it is talk, and so far we haven't seen all that much action. There's very few Tesla batteries actually being made right now. Mostly Tesla is reliant on Panasonic, CATL, LG Energy Solutions. Much of this stuff, perhaps for understandable reasons, is completely ignored by most people. Most people in the real world, the ethereal world, as I sometimes call it, people who think the world mostly revolves around data, intangible products. I used to be one of these people as well. Maybe not the people in this town, but many of the customers who buy the goods produced by the companies in this town. These people, and it's most people, frankly, have little conception that the batteries, for instance, inside their electric vehicles are made by a completely different company to the one which made the car. So for a lot of people, when they look at this car, what do they see? A Volvo. It's a Volvo. But what they don't see is the new Volvo EX90, the top of the range one, just kind of come out, just being manufactured now. What they don't see and understand is that the batteries inside there come from CATL mostly. So these are China-made batteries. When they look at a car like a Tesla in the UK, for instance, Tesla Model Y or Model 3, they don't realize that they're buying CATL batteries as well. They don't realize that if they're buying the long-range version, they're getting batteries made by LG, and if they buy the short-range version, they're getting batteries made by CATL. And we do seem, at the moment at least, quite incurious about what's going on inside these vehicles. And I think part of the issue here is we're encouraged as consumers not to spend much time thinking about where products actually come from. And in a sense, that's a success story of the post-1989 period of globalization. Why bother pondering the components inside a device when they just always they turn up? You just order them on your phone and they turn up. And for a car production company, they just turn up in the assembly plant just on time. If you need a component, if you need a fan belt, you order it, along it comes just in time. End of story, as far as most people are concerned. But for me, that was only the beginning of the story that I wanted to tell in this book. The real story of those devices is far deeper and far more fascinating, I would say, than most people realize. And we might just be living in one of those periods right now when all of this stuff about what goes inside the devices we're using, how it's made, where it comes from, really matters. It matters in a big way that maybe it didn't quite so much in the past. Let me give you an example. Sorry, that's the battery that goes inside there. Let me give you an example. So the new iPhone, just announced by Apple a couple of days ago. Everyone's very excited by it. Latest generation, 16, iPhone 16, 16 Pro, new watches as well. Tellingly, perhaps, though, okay, so in the presentation that Apple did, they talked a lot about how advanced the chip was in there. They talked a lot about how amazing this technology was. There were diagrams of all the semiconductors going on inside there. You had glimpses of the manufacturing process. But at no stage did Tim Cook acknowledge, for me, perhaps the most important thing, which is that Apple doesn't actually make its own devices. It doesn't make a single one. So the iPhone is an extraordinary thing, but ultimately what it is a carefully designed complex of chips, circuitry, sensors, batteries, all sorts of other parts as well. Countless companies around the world are providing these things, sending them in, not even to Apple, but to Foxconn usually, and they get assembled there. Apple doesn't even touch a single part of this phone until it kind of arrives with you. And this is quite significant. If you think about the difference between the Henry Ford obsession about making everything and the Apple model. And the Apple model is closer to what we have in most businesses these days. The vast majority of businesses. This is the conventional wisdom about how you should do business, is you basically are managing a supply chain. It's the Tim Cook model. And Tim Cook, the thing that distinguishes Tim Cook, that makes him an extraordinary businessman, is that he is one of the best managers of supply chains in history. It's not really about devices or about being able to give keynotes. It's about managing this, being able to make billions of phones without making them yourself, which is quite an extraordinary management story. But when you drill down into the iPhone, okay, so let's think about the iPhone and let's go kind of deeper inside it. And fear not, exactly the same thing applies for Samsung phones and indeed other models of smartphone as well. Okay, but drill down into it. Consider the logic chip inside, so the processor. It's marketed as Apple Silicon, the one inside there, but it's actually made by a different company entirely. It's not made by Apple. It's got the Apple brand on the outside, but it's made by TSMC in a fab in Taiwan. And that TSMC fab wouldn't be able to make those chips without something called EUV photolithography machines made by ASML. That's a photolithography machine. Okay, basically what this is doing with all of those, you see those purple lights, it's beaming a little bit of EUV light, which is an extraordinary kind of light that doesn't exist in the known universe, down onto the chip to create those little patterns of transistors. That ASML would not be able to make those machines without, in turn, look at the machine, thousands of different components from all sorts of other places as well, from companies like Trumpf. They make the lasers, Zeiss, who provide the lenses. And as I say, what's going on inside there is absolutely mind-bending. Because that form of light I mentioned, EUV, the wavelength of EUV light is shorter than the wavelength of visible light. And it doesn't exist, this type of light doesn't exist in the atmosphere as we know it. So you have to try and create it. And in order to create it, you need to have a vacuum chamber inside these machines. You heat up some tin until it's molten. You drop some molten tin down into the chamber in a kind of continuous stream. Each of the droplets of tin is zapped by 2 lasers, not just lasers, but the most powerful lasers in the world. 1, 2, zap. And within that process, it creates a little tiny bit, a tiny bit of EUV light that's then bounced around, you see the purple bits, bounced around onto a waiting little silicon wafer. And that is what helps you create transistors that are so small that they are literally invisible. You cannot see them because they're smaller than the wavelength of visible light. They're smaller than a coronavirus. They are the most exquisite thing that we can make as a species. However, the point that I want to make about this is that's only the beginning of it. That's just the beginning of it. The story of the thing that you hold inside your pocket is far more complex than all that. The silicon wafer, let's talk about the silicon wafer that actually goes into that machine, and then you use those lasers to brand little transistors onto it. So consider where that silicon wafer actually came from. So everyone is familiar with a smartphone. A small number of people that may be familiar with the chips inside them, TSMC and so on. A tiny, tiny fraction of people might be familiar with ASML. Barely anyone contemplates the silicon wafer itself. But the wafer is also another extraordinary human creation. It's the most perfect thing we can mass produce on a large scale. It's near perfect in its chemical ingredients, near perfect in its atomic structure. But this perfect thing began as a rock blasted or dug out of a quarry or a mine. So that's a quartz mine. That's where a silicon chip comes from. It doesn't seem very clean or technologically advanced, does it? But every single thing we touch on a daily basis begins somewhere like that for the most part. On a mine or quarry, sometimes it's pumped out of the ground. Occasionally there's organic stuff like crops and trees, but usually they're fertilized with something that we've also dug out of the ground. Everything we touch, however clean it seems, begins coming out of the ground in a place like that. Now, consider the silicon chip. We're going on a journey with a little lump of silicon coming out of there. The lump comes out. It's taken to a place where it is put into an electric arc furnace like this. Then it's turned into metallurgical silicon. So metallurgical silicon is about 99.9% pure, which sounds pretty pure to you and me, doesn't it? But actually, that's nowhere near pure enough if you're going to make a silicon chip. So you need to go and purify it again. And then you need to do something called the Siemens process. And the Siemens process basically takes it and breaks down all of those silicon atoms again, forms them into what look like almost kind of kettle, the bits in an old kettle, the kind of furring that you sometimes get the limescale in a kettle. But no, that is 99.9999999. It's 10 nines. Have I said 10 nines yet? I think I need another 99% pure silicon. And that sounds pretty amazing, doesn't it? But that's still not pure enough. So it has to get taken off, shipped around the world again to another factory entirely, where that is melted down in a crucible made of the purest quartz available anywhere in the world, which, by the way, you can only find in large quantities in one mine in the world. It gets melted down inside that crucible and then pulled up using a process called the Joukowsky process, pulled up and turned along the way when it's molten, and you end up with this. It's called a silicon boule, okay? And that silicon boule is that's the perfect thing. It's it is, I think, basically the most perfect thing that humankind can mass produce. And even then, actually, the process isn't quite finished because you still need to slice that up and polish it and treat it for weeks, if not months. And then it goes off to the fab, and then you get the transistors painted onto it, and it becomes part of a silicon chip. That is a process without which we wouldn't have the internet information age, we wouldn't have the internet, we wouldn't have the AI capabilities that Stuart was talking about earlier. It depends entirely on those processes. It depends on stuff coming out of the ground, being transformed in amazing ways. But that's just one of the backstories of one of the components, one component inside every smartphone in the planet. And you could do the same exercise for almost anything. For almost anything. The world is deep. These supply chains, as economists call them, it's a terribly boring term, but supply chains are deep and fascinating. And the deeper you go inside the life of all of these things that you're carrying with you every day, the more fascinating they become. But sadly, not many people spend time thinking about this stuff because we've been encouraged not to think about the physical magic inside the devices we're using every day. I happen to think this is a great shame. Thinking about where things come from, Henry Ford did, of course, all that time ago, opens your eyes to a few important realizations. First, these are amazing, wondrous processes. Few people are aware when they touch their phones on a daily basis that they are coming within millimeters of perfection, actual perfection made by humans, nanotechnology. And that inside that case is something that's close to nanotechnology. It's taken an extraordinary amount of energy. It involved generating a type of light that doesn't exist in the known universe. And it's based on lasers and machines that we could barely even fathom only a few years ago. You could say something similar about the batteries inside electric cars. Few people realize that the chemistry that's going on inside those batteries is a culmination of a century-long quest to create a battery powerful, light, and reliable enough to drive cars for hundreds of miles. It's a massive achievement. Second, the other point about this is making these items isn't just about the sci-fi processes that go inside it. It also involves dirty stuff. So you can't make a silicon chip without smelting down quartz into metallurgical silicon. And that means using an electric arc furnace. It means using the Siemens process, the Czochralski process, all of these things to turn that silicon into something perfect. These processes are old, many of them more than a century old, okay? And we all still depend enormously on them. So we don't just depend on TSMC, we depend on these ancient, almost Victorian processes to make the world happen, still today. Third, many of these processes involve the deployment of massive amounts of energy and the production of large amounts of carbon dioxide. So to get that silicon chip, you need to create lots of carbon. I'm going to say you don't need to, but right now with the processes we have, you do. These things are very carbon intensive, actually more carbon intensive by weight than steel, which is the thing that most people talk about when they talk about a metal that creates a lot of carbon. Yes, steel creates a lot more carbon because you're making more steel, but nonetheless, so too do silicon chips. And you know, in these mines, in these quarries, in these refining places, there's lots of smoke, there's lots of pollutants. But kind of back to what we were talking about earlier on, since we consumers have spent the past few years, decades really, being told that this stuff doesn't really matter, that you don't really need to be curious about what's going on inside your devices, that it doesn't really matter if the company that's selling it to you didn't actually make it, the opposite of the Henry Ford model. People are just unaware of this. And I just think we need to talk about it more. The fourth and the last thing that you realize when you look deeper into this world of kind of where stuff comes from and component parts is that making this stuff is hard. Making a business which can make money while making this stuff is also hard, if you see what I mean. So I spent the past few years kind of exploring all of these different chains. And the difficulty isn't making something amazing. Okay, you can make amazing stuff in the lab all the time, and I'm sure that many of you do here. It is just as difficult, possibly more difficult, to make it at scale, to send it out in billions around the world so you're changing the world. That is an enormous challenge as well, which is underappreciated. One of the lessons from Material World isn't just that these 6 materials that I focus on are such important ingredients. It's not just our ingenuity that's allowed us to turn those ingredients into astonishingly complex products like a silicon chip. We turn stone into silicon chips with transistors smaller as I said, than a coronavirus. It's not just that, it's that we've become incredibly good at doing it at an enormous scale and a low cost so everyone can own these things. A lot of the time within economics, there's quite a few people who moan that we just don't have enough productivity right now. We need more productivity. Why is it, some people complain, that we have things like social networks, but we don't have flying cars? What happened, people sometimes say, to all those amazing innovations of the past, things like Concorde? When I say, you don't need Concorde, how many people in the world actually flew on Concorde? Maybe 0.1% of the population? How many people own a smartphone? billions of people own smartphones, and it is the most advanced technology, the most advanced nanotechnology that we are capable of. That principle, I should say, is important, and I think people kind of forget that. The other one is that our ability to achieve net zero depends on being able to mass produce a staggering number of something else that is incredibly complex, which is batteries. And doing that involves new mass production techniques at massive scale. So it's getting this scaling up things so that billions can be produced is really tricky. And it turns out that actually Korea has a really good story to tell here about being able to do this with batteries, about being able to do this with semiconductors. And it's a story that many other people would like to learn. One of the things someone mentioned earlier was hydrogen. And I did have one thing. So I know there's lots of focus on hydrogen at the moment, but back to that point of scale. Hydrogen will change the world when we are able to produce green hydrogen at massive scale at low cost. But right now, it is not at massive scale at low cost. It's incredibly expensive. Let me give you one quick example. So there's a fertilizer plant in England where I come from. They've actually just shut it down. So our last fertilizer plant was shut down. So we don't make our own fertilizer anymore. We're also shutting down our last blast furnaces quite soon. So there's a whole backstory about deindustrialization from the country that gave the world the Industrial Revolution, but that's an entirely different conversation. But this factory, okay, it makes more or less enough fertilizer for most people in the UK to eat food. More or less enough. If you wanted, okay, because in order to make fertilizer right now, you take natural gas and you compress it and you get the hydrogen out of that natural gas and you use that hydrogen to grab nitrogen out of the air, and then you have ammonia. It's a type of fertilizer. So fertilizer that the food that we eat every day is a fossil fuel product. If you want to get that fertilizer and do it in a completely green way, which I think all of us would like to be able to do, then you need to take water and electrolyze it. But that is very, very energy intensive to do that. And to give you an example, so to replace the fertilizer that we're producing in that single plant in England with green fertilizer, which we would produce in the UK from wind turbines, you would need to take the entire output of the world's biggest wind farm just to provide the fertilizer coming from one plant that produces maybe not enough fertilizer for the UK. It's about 1.5 million homes worth of the power needs to be diverted to making green hydrogen. And this is one of the challenges. Until we start thinking about the realities of what it takes to make stuff at scale and do it cheaply, we risk deluding ourselves. And part of how we do that is we start to think about what's necessary to make the stuff we need. I'm going to give you just ends, and I'm sorry, I've blathered on so long that there is no time for questions, so I apologize for that. But come up to me afterwards if you did have any. Two quick lessons from Material World. I think the first is that more people think in terms of the practicalities of what it takes to get the products we need into our hands, the better. So Henry Ford might not have been right about trying to structure his business and make everything. So not every car company needs to make its own steel, but they do need to think right now about where those components come from. For a long time, economists convinced us that price was all that mattered, but it's not. Knowing where a component comes from and how it was made and how secure your supply of that component is, these are legitimate concerns. And I think that more companies are going to be focusing on them in the future. The second lesson is that while a lot of the technological challenges in the energy transition seem hard, possibly even insurmountable, let's not forget that people used to think that kind of thing about the technologies we now take for granted. So for years, people assumed it would be impossible to make iron and steel at the scale we can make today. Rediscovering the recipe for concrete. The Romans knew how to make concrete, and then we forgot. For 1,500 years, we forgot how to make concrete, and then we rediscovered how to make it. People didn't think we were going to be able to do that, but we did. Scientists doubted we were ever going to be able to tame extreme ultraviolet light, such as you saw earlier, or to use it to mass produce silicon chips. And in the early days of the motor car, finished with Henry Ford himself, he attempted to build his own electric car. He clubbed up with Thomas Edison, And if anyone could achieve this goal, it was going to be Ford and Edison, these two titans of industry. But it was hard. The chemistry wasn't there yet. Lithium hadn't been tamed as a battery material yet. So petrol won. But petrol won because we hadn't invented the perfect battery yet. But over the last 80 years, we have. An amazing thing has just happened. And Korea is part of the explanation for how that amazing thing is getting into billions of vehicles in the future. And so I'm mostly hopeful about what comes in the future. There are massive challenges out there, but thankfully, because there are amazing, promising, smart people here and elsewhere as well who are working on all of these challenges, I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to resolve them in the future. However, we do need all, hopefully, to be thinking a little bit more in terms of what is the life underneath the screen of that phone you're using? What's the backstory of the battery in the car that you might be driving in the future? What's the backstory of the food that you're eating right now? What is the fertilizer that it took to make it? Where did the water come from? I think we all need to be a bit more curious about where things actually come from, and then our world can be filled with wonder, and we can be less deluded about the challenges we're facing in the future. So that's my speech. I'm so sorry I ran over a bit, but come and ask me and we can have some questions and some chats afterwards. So thank you so much for listening.